Imagine a Russian winter night 100 years ago, snow falling onto the cobblestone streets of Moscow, winds howling in the dark alleyways. A young girl, 16 years of age, is standing outside, rubbing her hands together to get some semblance of warmth. Her name is Irina Lopatina. She and her brother Mikhail came to Moscow to buy some produce. At the market they met a man who offered them a pretty good price for flour. The man suggested they follow him back to his place to further discuss the transaction and maybe have a little drink to celebrate a deal well struck. They followed the man to his home and Mikhail went inside. But being a rather smart young man, he left all of the money with his sister and bade her wait outside. Come to think of it, it has been rather long since Mikhail entered the stranger's house. Suddenly, the door flies open and the man steps out. He roughly grabs Irina and drags her inside. She might have screamed briefly, not enough for anyone to take notice, or maybe paralyzed by fear she couldn't produce a sound. Having been dragged inside, she sees her brother lying on the floor, naked, his skull split open, slowly seeping blood into cloth rags carefully placed on the floor. The last thing the girl likely sees is the gruff man swinging a hammer at her head, and then the darkness takes her. Привет, my name is Andrei, and I'm here to tell you grim, mysterious, and often pretty depressing stories from the lands of the former Soviet Union. Not true crime specifically, but anything I find morbidly interesting. Today's story is about a crude, simple man who killed brutally and with no remorse, and kept getting away with it for quite some time. The time period during which it happened is almost more interesting than the case itself, but I have no aspirations of being a history channel. Still, it happened in Russia more than 100 years ago, and I'd wager not all of you instantly know what that means, so let me first set the scene. The year is 1921. In the New World, a young Alphonse Gabriel Capone is actively climbing the precarious ladder of organized crime. In the Old World, a certain Austrian painter becomes the leader of a certain political party in Germany. And to the east, the Russian Civil War is almost over, soon to be won by Lenin and his Bolsheviks. There are some last sparks of the anti-communist resistance left in Russia, but it's entirely too late for them. 3 years before, the entire Russian imperial family, including young children, was mercilessly massacred by the communists. The Russian Empire that stood for almost 200 years is no more, about to be replaced by around 70-odd years of the Soviet Union. It's in these tumultuous times of blood and death and the storm winds of change, a base creature in the rough shape of a human stalks the streets of Moscow. Vasily Komarov, Soviet Union's first serial killer. Komarov was born around 1877 near Vitebsk, a town which is now located in the northeastern part of Belarus, but back then was within the borders of the Russian Empire. Vasily was born Petrov, not Komarov. Much later in his life he will change his last name for reasons undoubtedly criminal, yet not entirely clear. He was one of 12 children of a railroad worker, Terentiy Petrov. They were lower class, basically peasants. Terentiy was a drunk. The pretty ubiquitous, grim, cruel, wife and child beating kind of drunk. Reportedly, the whole family were heavy drinkers. At some point, one of Vasily's brothers was sentenced to a life of hard labor for killing his boss while absolutely hammered. Vasily himself started partaking at the age of 10, and at 15 years old he was a proper alcoholic. He worked here and there, earning money for food but mostly drink, and was well known for petty theft and violent drunken outbursts. At the age of 20, Vasily was drafted into the Russian Imperial Army, where he got some semblance of discipline and structure to his life. But it didn't last. Having served 4 years, he returned home and married a local woman. Like his father, Vasily was cruel and abusive. And, like his mother, the wife joined in on the drinking and the domestic violence. I'd say they were perfect for each other. Perfectly disgusting approximations of humanity. Several years later, Vasily served a brief prison sentence for theft. He stole some apples from a warehouse to resell them and get some money for booze. While he was incarcerated, his wife cheated on him and then died, either from poisoning or from a heart attack. The record keeping was almost non-existent back then, so all we got is hearsay. It didn't much faze Vasily. There was no love lost between him and the wife. After getting out of prison, he moved to the city of Riga, which is now the capital of Latvia. There he remarried, choosing a Polish widow named Sofia. In contrast to his first wife, Sofia was quiet, fearful and submissive, an ideal target for Vasily's abuse. She also had 2 small children from her previous marriage, so, they didn't get to have a very happy childhood. Skipping a bit forward, and the year is 1917. The Bolshevik Revolution ignites Russia and forever transforms it. The old imperial order collapses. The red totalitarian nightmare has yet to form properly, so it's mostly chaos. The civil war is here. The communist Reds needed foot soldiers to fight against the Whites, the remnants of the royal loyalists. And Vasily took up the glorious revolutionary cause. Although he didn't give 2 shits about the ideological struggle, as much as the new regime didn't give a shit about his prolific criminal history. In their blood-red eyes, he was a victim of unjust prosecution by the bourgeoisie or something. The newly formed Red Army was a perfect fit for him, giving Vasily the opportunity to fully indulge in his violent tendencies. We know very little of what exactly he was doing, but we do know he participated in several executions of white officers and likely a couple of peasant massacres, becoming desensitized to killing. It's even fair to say that he acquired a certain enjoyment in dealing death, which was the last missing piece to the simple yet revolting puzzle of Vasily's personality. He eventually got promoted to a platoon commander and at some point was captured by the White Army. How the hell did he manage to not get executed and escape captivity is unknown, but around 1920 Vasily appeared in Moscow, finally under his new last name of Komarov. It's not clear why exactly he decided to change his name, but it's a safe bet that he was trying to hide away from the numerous misdeeds he racked up so far during his miserable life. Also, the Soviets were notoriously into executing those who were captured by the enemy and survived, considering them compromised and likely converted into spies. A veritable James Bond, Komarov was absolutely not, but changing his last name wasn't the worst idea. Somehow, right away, Vasily managed to buy an apartment on Shabalovka Street in Moscow, likely with the money he accumulated by robbing his fellow countrymen during the war, which is part and parcel of any communist takeover. Komarov brought his wife Sofia and her children to their new home, purchased a horse and a cab, and became an unassuming cabman, one of the many faceless Uber drivers of the early 20th century. Now, I know you're chomping at the bit, you bloodthirsty monster you, but before we get to the killings, a little bit of historical and social context, just to paint a better picture for you. First, the NEP or NEP, the New Economic Policy of 1921. In short, the commies started to run out of money, and the economy of the newborn Soviet Union was about to collapse. So the great and wise revolutionary leader Vladimir Ilyich Lenin decreed that we do a little bit of that dirty, disgusting capitalism. Just just a little bit, just the tip, to hold us over until the perfect communist paradise finally takes form. People got their private property rights, the ability to create enterprises and earn profit. It obviously gave a boost to the economy and it was a whole thing, but what is important for the story is that thousands of rural people from the lands around Moscow would travel to the city to buy or sell goods, be it produce, tools, or cattle. The second thing is the communal living, or as it is called in Russia, kommunalka. Famous Russian writer Mikhail Bulgakov, in his book The Master and Margarita, which I recommend you read, wrote thusly, and this is coming from the character of Voland, basically Satan, kind of. He says this about the denizens of Moscow. They're people like any other people. They love money, but that has always been so. Mankind loves money, whatever it's made of. Leather, paper, bronze, gold. Well, they're light-minded. What of it? Mercy sometimes knocks at their hearts. Ordinary people, in general reminiscent of the former ones. Only the housing problem has corrupted them. What's the housing problem? Again, in short, say you have an apartment or a house. The Soviet government goes, "Comrade, you have way too much living space. We decree that a single person requires exactly 9 square meters of space to live." For my lovely American viewers, it's around 96 square feet. If your living area is in excess of this government-mandated space, the government will forcibly put some random people there. And if you are the owner of the apartment, or God forbid, a whole building, you might also be an undesired element. A class enemy who, by owning property, is literally drinking the blood of the proletariat. And getting some strangers forced into your living space would be the best option. The alternative being imprisonment, exile, and/or execution. So the kommunalka was born. Strangers living together in a single apartment owned by the state, using the same kitchen, the same bathroom, not having any privacy. This obviously created severe overcrowding and completely destroyed any semblance of community and trust among the citizens. A great boon for the criminally inclined. If someone saw or heard something suspicious, there was almost no chance they would report it or even pay it any mind at all. Vasily's family lived alone in their apartment, either because the redistribution of domiciles was still a new and ongoing process, or because there were 4 of them, so they satisfied the square footage requirements. What is pretty funny is that this way of communal living lasted a long time. I was born just as the Soviet Union was wheezing its death rattle, and for the first 10 years of my life, my parents, my grandma and I lived in a kommunalka, in an apartment building older than the Soviet Union itself. We had 2 rooms to ourselves, and some other people I don't quite remember occupied the 3rd room. Only by the start of the new millennium, my parents managed to get enough money to buy a separate 3-room apartment in a new building. Kommunalkas still exist in Russia, although I would say it's a rarity these days. Most Russians have their own apartments or houses, but there are still people living like this even today. And finally, there was the law enforcement. The Soviet Union was much more interested in hunting down and exterminating political enemies, so the regular crime fighting kinda fell by the wayside. Also, thousands of hardened criminals were released from prisons during the destruction of the previous regime's judicial system. The Reds very quickly realized that this wasn't a very good idea, but the damage was done. Dozens of gangs in Moscow alone were terrorizing citizens. While some policemen who worked for the Russian Empire were allowed to join the Reds, a lot of them, especially higher ranks, were deemed enemies of the revolution and purged. The recently formed Moskovsky Ugolovny Rozыsk, the Moscow Criminal Investigation Department, was understaffed, and what staff it had lacked experience. By the way, remember I mentioned the murder of the Russian imperial family in the beginning? Well, here's a fun fact for ya. I had no idea about this before doing research for the video, but I found it pretty hilarious, so I had to include it. Meet Grigory Nikulin. At the point in time we are in our story, he is the head of the Criminal Investigation Department. A couple of years before, he was one of the men who executed the Romanov family. Grigory specifically was the one who shot the 13-year-old Prince Alexei. Although, to be fair to Grigory, according to his own words, he shot the little sickly hemophilia-ridden boy just once, and then just couldn't bear it any longer, and left. The prince was then shot several more times, and somehow surviving that, was stabbed with bayonets by Grigory's fellow courageous revolutionaries. So that's the person in charge of catching criminals in Moscow. Like I said, it's pretty funny. We have a saying in Russian, "Клин клином вышибают", the English equivalent being fighting fire with fire. So, to catch murderers, you gotta hire some murderers. Kinda makes sense, doesn't it? Morbid jokes aside, I think I've painted a clear enough picture of the times for you. War, discord, confusion, incompetence, distrust, fear, political and economic instability, anxiety, and a general lack of order. The Moscow of 1921 was the perfect hunting grounds for a beast like Vasily. He committed his first murder in February of 1921. His first victim was a rural man who came to Moscow to buy a horse. He met Komarov at the city horse market. Vasily lied about wanting to sell his horse, lured the man into his house with the promises of a good deal, and offered him some vodka to celebrate said deal. Once the man was properly drunk, Vasily picked up a hammer, snuck up behind his guest, and struck him in the side of the head once or twice. Whether it killed the man instantly or just stunned him, we don't know, but it doesn't matter. Because right after having incapacitated his victim, Vasily strangled the man with a piece of twine, just to be sure. Then Komarov undressed him, cut his throat with a knife, and carefully drained the blood onto a pile of cloth rags on the floor. Although it turned out to be a very messy ordeal, a lot of cleanup afterwards, and soon Vasily invested in a galvanized wash basin to drain the blood of his victims into. The purpose of the exsanguination was threefold. First, to make sure the victim is definitely dead. Second is to slow decomposition and reduce the weight of the corpse for easier transportation. And third, to avoid staining the burlap sack, which he would use to store the corpse in. To fit the body in the sack, Vasily used a specific packaging method. He would tie the wrists of the victim behind their back, draw the knees up to their chest, and to secure the legs, he would slide a rope under the knees and tie it behind their back. With the body packaged and placed in the bag, Vasily would store it in the pantry until nighttime. Under the cover of darkness, he would transport the body in his cab and bury it somewhere discreet, like an empty lot or near the bank of the Moskva River. What I personally find especially disturbing is that most of Komarov's victims were never identified. Even if they had any documents on them, which is unlikely for the times, Komarov would steal all their possessions to sell or destroy them. The way he killed, the blows to the side of the head, made the faces unrecognizable. I have the photos of victims, but obviously I cannot show them on YouTube, so if you are a weirdo like me, you can search for them yourself. The faces are simultaneously caved in and bloated, disfigured, maybe not beyond all recognition, but severely enough to make identification challenging. Then again, it almost didn't matter. Who was there to recognize them anyway? These were mostly people from far-off villages and towns, coming to Moscow to buy a horse or some flour. Someone's father, husband, son just left one day and never came back. Did they die on the road, killed by bandits or by weather or by overzealous communists looking for spies? There was no way to know, so most of Komarov's victims were never given a proper burial. Their families never found out what happened to them. While in this specific case it was a serial killer that ended their lives, in the coming years of the Soviet Union, the state will do a much better job of making people disappear than Komarov ever could. Around a month after the first murder took place, on the 13th of March, the first body was discovered. The snow started melting on an empty lot behind a residential building, and the people noticed a burlap sack sticking out. Sadly, it was not filled with treasures, but contained a naked and tied-up cadaver. The police and the medical examiner managed to gather some clues. The body was rather fresh. It lay buried under the snow for around 2 weeks. The skull trepanation revealed that the victim was very drunk before death. Apparently, you can tell by the smell after drilling a hole in the skull. The authorities also figured out that the murder most likely took place inside. The damage to the head would have been different if the victim wore a hat when he got his skull pulverized. And as you probably know, it's way too cold in Russia during the winter to walk around with your head uncovered. Also, the blood-soaked rags that covered the victim's head indicated that the killer tried to minimize the amount of blood leaking all over the place, which wouldn't have made that much sense if the murder took place outside. But the main clue was oats. There were oat seeds in the burlap sack. Horse feed. The victim, the killer, or both very likely had some connection with the bi-weekly horse market nearby. The police interviewed the merchants at the market, the workers at the inns and taverns, but to no avail. In a couple of weeks, the case, having gotten absolutely nowhere, went cold. The second body was discovered in early May, halfway between the market and the Moskva River. Children playing nearby saw a patch of disturbed ground and dug up another burlap sack. From this point on, the bodies would turn up regularly, once or twice per month. Some corpses were fresh, some pretty decomposed. All of them disfigured, tied up, and placed in a sack. All in all, over the course of 1921, 17 bodies were discovered. Among them, right before the end of the year, were the first ones that the police were able to identify. 2 bodies were found in a ruined house, a man and a woman. The authorities correctly guessed that the victims were related, and soon enough they connected the bodies to the missing Lopatin siblings, who came to Moscow to purchase some groceries. The 16-year-old Irina Lopatina was the only woman killed by Komarov. Later he would say that after dispatching her brother in the usual manner, Vasily discovered that he had left the money with his sister, who was waiting outside the house. She wouldn't come in voluntarily, suspicious of Vasily, thus he dragged her inside and murdered her as well. Most of the recent bodies were discovered in abandoned buildings, indicating that the killer had some trouble digging holes in the frozen ground. Police squads would lay in ambush near potential corpse hiding spots and near the banks of the Moskva River, speculating that the killer would try to submerge some of the bodies under the ice for a quick and easy disposal. But the only thing they achieved was getting their asses frozen on New Year's Eve. Komarov was well aware that the police were searching for him. He would often stand in the crowds gathered to gawk at the authorities unearthing another corpse, and one time he even helped out with pulling the body out of the ground. The piece of shit was clearly having fun living on the edge. At first, before each murder, he would remove his wife and stepchildren from the house, but at some point Sofia came back before Komarov could clean up all of the blood. She allegedly wasn't that distraught by finding out her husband was a merciless killer and started helping him. For example, one time Komarov was transporting yet another body and was stopped by a police patrol. The police didn't check the suspicious sacks, sadly, but this scared the shit out of Komarov. After that, he would take Sofia with him on his body disposal trips. A woman riding in a cab for a nighttime stroll, much less suspicious than a lone gruff man. Still, due to the police activity, Komarov got a little bit spooked and had to slow down with all of the murdering. Over the course of 1922, only 6 bodies were found. The same year, Sofia also gave birth to a son, which eventually would provide the final solid clue to the police. While Vasily was cunning and resourceful, further upgrading his tools of trade, like sewing patches of stronger fabric into his sacks to prevent tearing, smart enough to not get caught right away. A criminal mastermind he was definitely not. The meager amount of intellect he was born with, eaten away by the heavy drinking. One time Komarov was caught making some moonshine at his house, which was illegal. He was fined for that and got marked as a delinquent. His cab license also expired and he never deemed it necessary to renew it for some reason. While being a full-time serial killer, he was still committing petty crimes, which of course started to attract the attention of the police. When authorities discovered yet another body, the head of the victim was covered with a used diaper. Obviously not what you are imagining, not a modern diaper, as funny as it would look, but a specifically shaped piece of fabric. Vasily probably forgot to refill his stock of rags at some point and had to use his newborn's diaper to wrap the victim's bleeding head. The police had a pretty comprehensive profile of the killer now. A somewhat strong man, has a horse, probably a cab driver, lives somewhere near the horse market, his living space is secluded enough to facilitate discreet murders, and either he himself or his immediate neighbors just had a baby. This narrowed the suspect list from several thousand potential suspects to several dozen, and Komarov was on that list. Yet 1922 came and went, with the killer still at large. The citizenry was, as you can imagine, terrified and fed up with the inability of the Criminal Investigation Department to catch the murderer. They would complain and even write letters to the great revolutionary leader Lenin, imploring him to save them from the killer, though Lenin was too busy dying from syphilis and having strokes to help out the working masses with their trivialities. But the pressure on the ill-equipped Soviet police was consistently mounting, and they had to redouble their efforts, conducting raids in the area and interviewing people working at the horse market. Finally, in the early 1923, they had enough reasons to check out Komarov's house. The final straw being the fellas at the market telling tales of Vasily's uncanny ability to always have money for booze, while his license being suspended, not actually working anywhere and just hanging out at the market. On May 19, 1923, police arrived at Komarov's residence, officially due to rumors that there was an illegal moonshine operation going on, for which, as you remember, Komarov was already fined once. They entered the house and started searching. Vasily was calm and collected and cooperated with the authorities. And there is a parallel universe where he got away with all his crimes. Maybe not forever, but at least for a little while more. Because the police got really lucky. Having finished searching the house, they saw a closed pantry door and asked Komarov to open it. Vasily suddenly got really tense, mumbled that his wife had the key for the pantry, and then he just jumped out of the window and bolted, befuddled policemen giving a futile chase. When they opened the pantry door, they found a fresh victim, very much dead and bound in the usual Komarov style, ready for transportation. The body was still warm to the touch. They were maybe half an hour late. Vasily was caught the next day, hiding out at his acquaintance just outside Moscow. He confessed to 33 murders, although he said he couldn't recall how many he killed exactly. 30, 50, more, and he agreed to show where yet to be discovered bodies were hidden. When the news that the murderer was finally apprehended spread, crowds gathered to gawk at Komarov, pointing out his body hiding spots. Men swore, women screamed, and at some point the lawman had to fight off people trying to tear the killer apart. Which is understandable. Rumors galore that the killer was a beast who fed the entrails of his victims to pigs, and that the authorities found pillowcases full of money and jewelry hidden away, ill-gotten treasure stolen from those he butchered. They would call Komarov the man-beast, or the man-machine, the packer since he bound his victims, the butcher from Shabalovka Street, and other cool-sounding names that people sadly often give to such pieces of shit out of very natural fascination with the darker parts of the human condition. But Komarov was not half man, half beast. No grandiose notions of a natural evil lurked in his mind. He was, in the end, a very dull, emotionally stunted, cruel creature. Coming back to Mikhail Bulgakov, a novelist I mentioned earlier. He was actually in Moscow at the time, working as a freelance journalist to make ends meet. He visited the trial, and so we have a first-hand account of Komarov's character. Bulgakov, listening to Vasily speak, found him to be less than human, like an empty human-shaped case. There was no hatred, no rage, nothing bestial about him. Only indifference and a thick layer of contempt. I met people like this. Not murderers probably, but I'm sure you met them too. People who despise everything around them. Whatever you say to them, they would smirk and tell you something negative. Successful people, they're crooks. Every single one, stealing money from everyone around them, or they were born privileged, 10 silver spoons protruding from their mouths. Got a new job? Yeah, well done. Gonna work for the man, living off scraps while life is passing you by. And so on. This was Vasily Komarov. When he was asked about the death of his first wife, he simply said, to hell with her. When questioned how he committed the murders, he giggled and said, "Ras и квас," which can be translated as easy as pie or just like that. There was zero remorse, or even considering how amused he sometimes became, smiling, giggling and giving dumb answers, there was negative remorse. Most of the answers he gave were "Хрен его знает," who the hell knows. According to Komarov, there were two reasons for the murders. First, money. He didn't get rich from robbing his victims, but it was enough to eat and drink to his heart's content, and that's about all he needed. The second reason, he didn't like people. Imagine you have the opportunity to stomp on a cockroach or something equally disgusting, and also get 20 bucks. It's a win-win. That's how Komarov saw it. He had no empathy for fellow men, only contempt. And so, Komarov and his wife were quickly judged, sentenced and executed by a firing squad. Their children were given away to government care and disappeared into the system. That's how the story ends. In conclusion, I wouldn't say that as a serial killer, Vasily was anything special. His reign of terror lasted as long as it did only due to the incompetence of the Criminal Investigation Department and the overall chaos of the times. Komarov wasn't a mysterious drifter hopping from town to town, leaving a trail of dead bodies, a shadowy figure impossible to capture. This degenerate hid the corpses within a couple of square kilometers, less than a square mile around his own house, basically shitting where he ate. Murder itself was ever present then, and very soon, thanks to the communists, reached an industrial scale. But technically, Komarov was the first documented serial killer in the newborn country of the Soviet Union. And so his sordid name lives on after more than 100 years. Now, for better or for worse, through my video. Which is now over. Thank you so much for watching the video until the very end. If you enjoyed it, I would appreciate your subscription. More videos to come very soon, but for now, до свидания.